To open the panel and to open the Helen and Cecil Rose Ethics and Communication Conference, it's a pleasure to introduce the undergraduate student body president, Steve Scott. Steve?
Hi, thank you. The first thing I wanted to do was just say how wonderful it is to see such great numbers at 10 a.m. on a Thursday. I'm kind of surprised and pleased by that, to see so many students up and awake at this time. Emerson College, as the leader in the field of communications, has a right and a responsibility to take such an active role in evaluating such an important issue as looking at the ethical question involved within the media, especially when we see the vast focus on it as of late. That's why when I first heard from Dr. Payne about a panel discussion and an all-day activity such as this, I was immediately excited and pleased that something was going to be going on with such experts that could interact within our students. As a four-year student of Emerson College, I've heard a lot about the change and the transition that has occurred within the media in the past 4 years and within the past decade especially. I've heard the phrase a lot: we have moved from communicators to manipulators of our social truths. With that change also becomes a greater responsibility of ethical questions. I look around here and I see so many people who will be the communicators of tomorrow, so many of my peers, and some of the questions that I've heard asked throughout the dormitories, I've heard asked throughout the dining halls for years now. And I think that to get an exchange such as we're going to have throughout the entire day, going to I think 9 p.m. tonight, is a wonderful chance for so many of the students here at this college to really get an insight into such an important topic. So I know that there's a lot of speakers to speak today, so I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I would like to introduce at this time the Vice President of the college and Academic Dean, Phil Amato, who has been here much longer than I have.
Thank you. Good morning. And on behalf of the college, it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the Helen and Cecil Rose Ethics and Communication Conference. Through the generosity of the Rose family and the wonderful efforts of Dr. Payne and his staff, we have before us today a wonderful day-long conference that will address some of the most promising, but at least pressing ethical issues and problems in communication today. The conference brings together a number of prominent professionals and academics from a variety of communication areas to address the issues that they confront on a daily basis and in their professional careers. And we're quite fortunate to have them here with us today. I can recall a rather provocative and exciting seminar on ethics that I took as an undergraduate nearly 40 years ago. We discussed at length and with great passion the issues of ethics as they related to communication. We dealt with the pros and cons of rhetoric. We examined the methods and techniques of the sophists, demagogues, ideologues, and propagandists. We concluded that the answer to the evils of misinformation and unethical communication, conveyed consciously or unconsciously, was an educated and enlightened audience. Our reasoning went something like this: the more educated the public, the less effective misinformation. The broader the audience, the greater the probability that misinformation would be detected and countered. And we also concluded that mass media would make it difficult for misinformation to succeed. There are those who would say that we were hopelessly naive. I don't think so. I think we may have underestimated the time and effort it might take to achieve such goals. I think we were naive in comprehending the staying power of specious rhetorical devices. But the premises are not flawed. Today's conference represents the commitment that many scholars and professionals and practitioners have made to the study of ethics and communication. and the need for an ongoing examination of the issues related to responsible communication. As the demarcation lines between news and entertainment, between fact and fiction, and between truth and reality, generated in part by technological advancements and in part by profit motives, the need for examination and introspection by those of us in communication becomes crucial. Hopefully, this conference will help us meet those needs, help us to elevate the debate, and help us to better understand the dynamic role of ethics and communication in an ever-changing global environment. Again, I invite you to partake and participate in today's activities, and I wish you a provocative and exciting day. Thank you.
We can now start. I think the Boston Globe has arrived, right? What I would like to do very briefly is just ask you to take a look at your program, because as Phil and Steve has said, you're going to see that it's a very exciting potential opportunity for you to interrelate with some of the cutting-edge professionals. This morning, we're going to try to limit our comments to be as brief as possible. What we're going to find each of our individuals today doing is presenting a 5-minute synopsis of some ethical issues that they find inherent within their particular professions. And in the first panel, what we see are a group of individuals and leaders in the areas of marketing and advertising, etc. Lisa Rogar, who's going to moderate, is going to tell you more about that. I would like to invite you later on today. We're going to have a keynote speaker by Rance Crane, who many of you follow in his many publications. He is, of course, known for Advertising Age by all of our MCOM people who read it judiciously, etc. We're then going to have a very exciting panel this afternoon that's going to delve into a very important issue with regard to the mediated realities that we face, and that is the docudrama format, and in particular, the Academy Award nominee quiz show. With that, we have executive producers, we have historians, we have individuals who are experts in that era. Judy Kletter has put out a marvelous amount of effort, she and Michael, in bringing together some of the best people in the country to talk on this issue. So I invite you to come back and to partake in that. And then after, as you can see, if you're students and if you're visitors to Emerson College, we have receptions, 15 to 20 minutes in which you can pick the minds of these individuals. And then this evening later on, what we're going to have is someone addressing what seems to be a very slippery issue with regard to politics, ethics, and communication, and that's Ken Anderson, who of course many of you know from the University of Illinois, one of the leading scholars in ethics and communication. So right now it's a pleasure to give you someone who's got a very tough time, and that is to keep people to 5 minutes and then to keep the questions, but someone who I know doesn't lose debates in our division, Lisa Rogar. Dr. Rogar?
Good morning to all of you here. As Greg said, my name is Lisa Rogar from the Division of Communication Studies, and I'll be moderating the day's first panel entitled Ethics and Communication, General Strains and Pressure Points in Today's Media. More so than the panels that will follow later in the day, this morning session provides something of a general overview of ethical issues faced in a variety of contexts: advertising, film and television, newspaper and print media, college and university settings, and public relations. Each of the distinguished panel members to my right will be outlining, as Greg said, some of the ethical issues that they face in their respective professions. And let me introduce this prestigious group to you now. We're really lucky to have all of them here. At the far end of the table is Rance Crane, publisher and editor-in-chief of Advertising Age. Sitting next to Mr. Crane is Dan Kimmel, film and television critic and the local correspondent for Variety magazine. Brian McCrory is next, a news and political writer for the Boston Globe. Sitting next to Mr. McCrory is Ken Anderson, Vice Chancellor and Professor of Ethics and Communication at the University of Illinois. Next to Ken Anderson is Sean Tracy, National and Regional Television Producer and Director and President of Sean Tracy Associates, whose primary focus is commercials and advertising. And finally, Terry Clark, founder and chairman of Clark & Company Public Relations and founder and chairman of Clark & Goward Advertising. Please give a welcome to all of our panelists today. After each of our panelists do make a short statement, our respondents to this morning's panel are Professors Ellen McDonough and Dennis White from the Divisions of Comm Studies and Mass Communication. They'll be speaking briefly afterwards. And finally, with some luck, we will have some time for some questions and discussion and dialogue with the audience at the end of this session. We hope you find this panel both intriguing and thought-provoking, and it's time to begin. So we'll start with Rance Crane. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do I turn this on or something? Oh, is it okay? I have a simple criterion for ethical media behavior. Any factors that conspire to prevent the telling of the full and complete story, in my mind, and in the mind of our reporters and editors, is unethical and unacceptable. Now that includes reporters' biases, conflicting interests on the part of the big media conglomerates that are more and more shaping the communications landscape, and also, and maybe especially, hidden agendas that we as readers know nothing about. Let me give you an interesting example that just occurred within the last several days. On Monday, I believe it was, the Wall Street Journal ran an editorial talking about how the Bass brothers withdrew a $20 million grant to Yale University to fund a program on Western civilization. And the interesting thing about it was that up until that point, nobody knew that the Bass brothers had withdrawn this grant. That was a news story, but yet it was in the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. And then the next day, in the news section of the Wall Street Journal, they had a story on that development, and they quoted, which I've never heard of before ever. They said, our editorial page broke this story, which was unbelievable to me. And so I had to think of why this would occur. And here we go again about hidden agendas. And the only reason that I can come up with that this happened is that in some instances, in some respects, there's a sort of a uneasy feeling between the news side of the Wall Street Journal and the editorial side of the Wall Street Journal. The editorial side is much more conservative. I think that the editorial side was afraid to give this story to the news side because the news side would distort the story. As the editorial side put it, the ostensible reason that Yale University returned this grant was that the Bass brothers wanted to control the curriculum of this Western civilization study program. But I think, at least from the Wall Street Journal's point of view, that they think the real reason was because Yale University faculty, and perhaps students too, were having a very hard time putting together a program on Western civilization that some students and faculty members thought emphasized one particular civilization over another. And in this day of political correctness, you cannot do that. So, in my Machiavellian mind, the Wall Street Journal's editorial pages wanted to control this story. So they broke it first, and then the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and everybody else on the editorial side picked it up. Now that's the kind of hidden agenda that I think is intriguing on the one hand, but very, very dangerous on the other. So with that statement, I think I would like to turn it over to somebody else and let them talk about what are important ethical issues from their point of view. Thanks.
Okay, I was a little surprised when I was asked to appear on this panel because as a film and TV critic, my chief ethical issue is whether I should give away the ending of the movie. However, what I'd like to use my brief time this morning is to say a few kind words about censorship. Now, before anybody leaps out of their chairs, I'm on the board of directors of the Massachusetts affiliate of the ACLU, so I'm obviously not talking about the state telling us what we can write or read or say or hear. What I'm talking about is an idea of self-censorship, of having standards. Let me illustrate this with a story. Chuck Jones, the great Warner Brothers animator, is responsible for a lot of the classic Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner cartoons, is sitting in his office one day with Michael Maltese, his writer and collaborator on many of these cartoons, when in comes the producer of the Warner Brothers animation unit. According to Jones, the way he tells the story, the producer was a singularly humorless man who came in with like no preparation and announced there will be no bullfighting in our cartoons. Bullfighting is not funny. And with that, he walks out. And Jones and Maltese look at each other and go, well, what are we going to do in our bullfighting cartoon? They had had no plans to do a bullfighting cartoon, but because they were told they couldn't, they went ahead and did Bully for Bugs, which if you're a Warner Brothers cartoon fan, you know is one of the classic Bugs Bunny cartoons. My point here is that by having standards, by having taboos, by having rules that you shouldn't, not can't, but shouldn't do something, the writer of, or producer or director of a TV show or a film, or for that matter of newspapers or news magazine shows, has something to test themselves against. They have to be that much more creative if they're going to come up with a good reason to violate that taboo. The perfect illustration of that, of course, is currently the show NYPD Blue on the ABC network, which is doing a lot of things that we've always been told you can't do on commercial television, and they're doing it very well because they're saying, see, there's a reason here. We've thought about this. We're not just doing it because we can get away with it. Too much of what's going on in the media today, and I include journalism in this as well, in all its forms, is being done simply because it draws an audience, simply because we can do it. Drawing an audience is no great trick. Last June, you may recall, a lot of TV stations put on a white Bronco going down a California highway, and they had more than 50% of the viewing audience. It's not a trick to draw an audience. The trick is to come up with a reason to do so. I'm sure most of you are aware of a controversy surrounding a TV talk show hosted by Jenny Jones. In a sentence, she invited two people to come on to reveal a secret admirer. It turned out the secret admirer was another man. The person who was thus fooled into appearing on the air for one reason or another couldn't accept this and ended up murdering the person and then turning himself in. What is shocking to me beyond that story is the reaction in the media. TV executives, producers are saying, well, we're not especially proud of shows like this, but it draws an audience. Well, to me, the biggest ethical issue facing us today is if you can't come up with a reason other than it draws an audience, it probably shouldn't be on the air.
I'd like to agree fully with Dan on virtually all of his points. When that white Bronco was riding down the highway, I was in a Los Angeles hotel room, and I turned on my TV and said, there goes OJ blowing my deadline. That happened to be my second, what we call in the media, gangbang in the course of a year. The first one was out in Portland, Oregon, involving Tonya Harding. And when I was out there, for really the first time in my career, I saw what was happening to media ethics. It was really the tabloidization of mainstream journalism. We were out there from the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and we're competing head-to-head with shows like the American Journal, Hard Copy, A Current Affair, and we're competing with a disadvantage. They were all passing envelopes filled with money to people they wanted to talk to. We were just asking them to talk to us just for the sake of getting things right. It doesn't work well that way at all. When it got to the case of O.J. Simpson, that dwarfed the Tonya Harding case, and we see now pressure points being applied all over the place to media ethics. It's not a good day in the media when at the Globe and at the New York Times we're actually quoting hard copy in our coverage and what they're reporting. And I found myself doing that again and again. I don't have the answer yet where it takes us or what we do about it, although I agree with Dan that much of what we're doing is simply to provide interesting coverage and to get readership and viewership. It's not good, and I'm open to any suggestions anyone has what we can do about it.
Well, I feel like a duck out of water in a sense. Here I am, an academic, to talk about academic issues amidst a group of practitioners who have said many things that I heartily endorse. I should also comment, since I get a chance to dwell on some of the issues they've touched on tonight, I'll probably try to take the view of, hey, here I am a teacher of communication. What kinds of ethical issues crop up in my role, and particularly not addressing the media directly, but as preparing and working with students who work in the media. Let me say to begin with that every teacher faces an amazing number of ethical issues every time they walk into the classroom. What is my coverage to be of my subject matter? How much of me threads into that coverage? How do I pull myself, my culture, my values, my standards out? How do I treat other people in that classroom with the respect they earn as persons of moral worth? And when we begin to think about diversity issues, that whole range of concerns that have become much the target of those who accuse us of excess political correctness, it certainly is a tremendous dilemma. We're constantly evaluating our students, but it's important to note also that in the academic world we place tremendous responsibility upon evaluation of our peers. That person who is my friend, colleague, co-author, and dinner buddy may tomorrow be the individual who's being reviewed for tenure, and I cast the deciding vote. No, this is not a person who's going to have a career at this university. And I've known too many people who've lost their future. I have a son-in-law, for example, or a nephew who, for example, lost a tenured position, did not get another one, went through the slough of despond, his marriage broke up. I mean, these are very real consequences. And here you sit balancing your responsibility to make that decision about your colleague with the knowledge of the implications of what you do if you follow. Obviously, there are issues of assigning grades, all those things students focus on. As a communication teacher, it seems to me we have a kind of unique set of responsibilities because we need to orient people to the awesome task of the impact of the choices they make as they engage in the process of communication, as they negotiate the way in which we'll live with one another, what the rules are of selection, what the rules are of what I'll telecast, what I'll put on, what I won't, whatever those things may be. So there are tremendous implications. What is my purpose? What are the means I'll use in accomplishing that purpose? Do I settle for effectiveness? Do I settle for a mass audience? Do I settle for a smaller audience, but an audience that receives the message I want to send? What is the balance between what is effective and efficient and what is ethical and responsible for me to do? How do I weigh a short-term effect? How do I weigh a long-term effect? How do we talk about what is to be done in the terms of my interest as a communicator, as a source of communication, versus the immediate receivers of that communication and their role, versus the impact on the larger society? What are we creating in the slippery slope, in a sense, as we begin to say, yes, this is acceptable, yes, this is acceptable, yes, this is acceptable? What day does a snuff film become acceptable on general television? Well, maybe we'll have to talk about censorship. The last thing I want to say very quickly is, it seems to me that as a communication instructor, we have not served the general public well because we focus too much on those who are preparing to go into the communication field and not nearly enough those who are the targets of all of us in the communication field. What ought we to be providing for the general student as they are being prepared to live in an information age? I'm deeply concerned about the withdrawal on the part of large numbers of our public from participation in the civic. Notice I didn't say civil, I said civic life. My students don't vote. My students don't get interested in politics. My students don't participate in a shared civil life of the community, whether it's in student election or general popular election. So I guess what I would say finally is we need to think about the ethical responsibility of how we prepare people to live in this coming age and not be buried or mired in the information swamp.
Well, I'm hoping that today I don't get perceived as the Antichrist, because what I do is I'm in the TV commercial advertising field, and I'm a director and I have been a producer. But let me give you a little bit of background. About 12 years ago, I graduated from Brown University with a degree in religious studies and ethics, ethical philosophy. And that's about the last time that I've heard anything about ethics. Certainly not in the business that I'm in. In fact, I can honestly say that I've been directing TV commercials for 10 years, and I've never heard anyone say, "Is this ethical?" Never been a question. It seems as though there are rules and laws that we follow, but whatever you can do within these rules is fair game. But perhaps, as Dan Kimmel put it, my industry might be self-censored. In that way, in trying to sell a product, there may be certain limitations. Certainly advertisers are not want to bring negative attention to themselves. So most of the time, I think we all have this perception as to what is right or what can be done. But it's never really discussed. That's the interesting thing. You know, this is the world of Special K and the milk ads. I've done ads for nursing homes that I think have a inherent fear factor built into them. Talking about rules, I've done commercials for Easy Off oven cleaner. And in that, we had to use, they do a before and after type situation with these ovens and how they were used. We had to use 23 different shells or interiors of an oven and actually have a signed affidavit from up to, I think it was 6 different people that said that the shells that we showed and that we edited in from before and after were actually the identical shells for each commercial. And because we wanted more than one take, we had to have all of these different pieces. And that's crazy. I mean, it really wouldn't have made much of a difference to anybody, I think, with the way that the technical experts had done such research to figure out exactly what kind of grime and grease that Easy Off would take off the ovens. It was pretty much, you know. But as I said, in 10 years, I've never been asked anything about whether this is ethical. Specifically, I want you to know the kind of work that I do could probably be called the most coercive kind of work that is done in advertising. There are directors who specialize in shooting food or shooting special effects or shooting cars. I am a people shooter, people expert. And what I do is not bathing suits and TNA and coercive things in terms of pictures, but what I do, the kind of work that I do, is manipulation of the subconscious. It's at the emotional level. I try as hard as I can to make you as viewers believe that what you are seeing is real people going through real emotional moments on film. And in fact, most of the time they're not. They're actors. So that's where I come from. My job is to create a false world, hopefully effective at selling a product. Steve Scott used the word manipulators, and that's me.
May I move my seat? As chairman of both an advertising agency and a public relations firm employing approximately 70 people between the two of them, I guess I could offer up that there are some items that I won't discuss that anybody as an employer could talk about in the way of issues that face us all in the business that we do, whether we're dean, whether we're a president of a college, or whether we're an employer of people. And I'll abandon that for the moment and address rather the two industries of advertising, if I may, who use wonderful people like this young man to my right to make those false impressions. And as also public relations, address both of them. I think advertising, there are fewer probably of all the disciplines out there, there are fewer ethical questions in advertising, ironically because it's probably the most policed. That commercial that he puts together, if it's to run on national network, will not get on if it breaks any ethical, if it comes up against any ethical questions or ethical issues. For every 2 commercials, or for every commercial you see on national network television to this day, there are probably 5 or 6 that were shot down before those 2 got shown. So we have a built-in policing that goes on in the advertising business. One might say, thank God. It's interesting, isn't it? It's probably the least believed, people say, medium out there, advertising, yet it's the most policed. The one that's the least policed is public relations. And if more people in this room understood what indeed goes on in public relations, there would probably be more bills filed tomorrow and people coming down on us and whatever, because of what people in public relations are able to get away with. People don't know what they're doing. That's the ethical question. And ethics really, is it not, one of really like beauty in the eyes of the beholder. There are people who indeed would see nothing wrong with toying with the minds of a particular audience through a variety of third-party persuasion, which is what we use, which is what public relations is all about. We rely on the media, which is a third-party source, and we rely on opinion leaders, which are third-party sources in a community. We have wonderful ways of identifying who are the opinion leaders in any society. We can come into this university, this college, and tell you who are the 25 most listened to people in this institution. There's a way to go about finding that out. And then influencing those 25, and guess what? Within a certain period of time, I can go back and check it out, and you'll probably all pretty much agree with each other on one particular issue. And there are ways to go about doing that. And advertising, it's said, is one of those tools, by the way. The greatest ethical issue we have in advertising, I'll jump back to advertising for a moment, is the issue of political advertising. It's the only area which is unpoliced. You may, when I do a commercial, whether it's in this market or for national television, I must pass it through equity, through the legal department, must meet all the requirements of what makes up for a good 28-second commercial, allowing time for the sign on and off. And they will tell me whether or not I can do it. I must back it up and support it with all kinds of information. That is not so with political advertising. If you are a station and a politician hands you a commercial, you must run it as is, no questions asked, providing it's in good taste. And we've all seen the good taste in commercials that have been run, and which, by the way, is probably the greatest influence in giving advertising a bad name, is what's going on in the political side. The other concern we have in our business, on the public relations side, when we get back to it again, is, and it's a real concern, of what's happening in the journalism community. With due respect to all my journalism compatriots here on the panel, our greatest concern is somewhere along the way somebody lost control of the publication, of the station, of the network. It seems in our own local newspapers that everybody's in control of something, but nobody's in control of the paper. And as a result, I think the papers have lost their view. They've lost where they're going. They've forgotten their mission. It's to inform, educate, and entertain, and I would add to possibly support the community. That's not what we see occurring. We see the journalism community, particularly in some areas of the country, tearing the community apart. And that's where we feel, as public relations people, a responsibility to bring together, where we can, our community.
Before we continue on with comments from our respondents, we thought it might be interesting if the panel members themselves might ask questions of each other for a few minutes here, since you seem to be representing diverse views. So I encourage you to begin a conversation here. Questions of each other?
Yeah, I've actually got a question on that last talk.
I was hoping you might.
Yeah, all in good fun here. I'm
Yep.
surprised to hear you paint PR people as the white knights saving the community. And the local press is the institutions that are tearing the community down. Why would you want a newspaper that has one uniform view, meaning one controlling person running that whole paper, editing, censoring? What does a community get out of that? And what are your examples of a newspaper like the Globe or the Herald tearing down the community?
Let me come back to maybe what you took away from all having one view perspective. When I say a view, it's more of a vision for a city. It seems that, right, in particular, the media in this town, in any town, it seemed because of any number of factors, not the least of which is there's very little time today to research and dig out and do the stories that one would like to do because of the lack of staffing, because of the diminishing amounts of advertising. It would allow for more pages and more page space. There are any number of things that are influencing your industry that are preventing, I think, different reporters for the different media from pursuing a story from all angles as it might in digging up a good old fashion reporting, if you will. I can go down through probably, I wish I'd have brought today's newspapers, and I could probably have cited some in particular, of a view. On one page we'll have a columnist supporting a particular issue, and in the editorial page taking that same issue apart, and a news story on the business page that takes even a third view of that. None of which seem to all relate one to the other and leave the reader confused. One would argue, well, isn't it nice that you have these three views to select from and build your own? Again, we get back to the first question. This is an educational environment, and I think it's healthy, number one, to have and establish a good debate. Indeed, as it's been depicted, journalism as a profession or a trade these days is seen more as one of tearing apart, if you will, and indeed the role and the definition of public relations is indeed to bring things together. People of opposing views through common values.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Sean about his views on advertising. Are you unhappy that there hasn't been more of an ethical discussion during your last 10 years, or do you think it's because most of the advertising that's done is acceptable and on the up and up, or do you think there should be more discussion of these ethical issues?
Actually, I can say that most of the time, I think we all operate under the idea that people understand that what they're viewing is intended to motivate them in a certain way. So I'm hoping and expecting that everybody has their antenna up to begin with. And so therefore I don't really feel that we need to really get into, on a day-to-day basis, well, is this an ethical thing to do? And I think, as it's also been said, we all operate with this ceiling, which is, well, we couldn't possibly do that. And we don't even discuss it because we know that we couldn't do it. It just wouldn't get aired.
I think in some respects, Sean, you're being a little too hard on yourself when you say that you deal with a false world. Plays, all kinds of drama, they all deal with a false world. Everybody knows it's acting. Everybody knows that they're trying to sell products. Everybody knows that they're actors. And to say that these people do not have genuine emotions, I think that's pretty much understood by the people who view your work.
The interesting thing, as I said about my particular work, is that my show reel, or the reel that I use to market myself, I can bring it to 10 very, very astute, very experienced advertising professionals, creative directors, writers, etc. And I would say maybe 50% of the people that are on my reel are real people, and 50% are actors. And most of the time, I would say that these astute advertising individuals get it wrong. They think the actors are the real people and the real people are the actors. So that's where I think it becomes a little bit like creating a false world. And it's, yes, they do have emotions, but we're really trying to blur as much as possible the distinctions between the acting and the reality.
I'd just like to pick up on that. It seems to me that in general, when you pick up a novel or when you go to a theater, you go to a movie, you know that this is a created reality and there are conventions about this. Just as they're not as highly structured perhaps as when you go to opera where you have to accept a whole series of conventions. Whereas I think for many people, what they see in advertisements, what they see in various kinds of representations is not seen by them in that same mode and in that same setting. I think they do take it as a kind of reality. In the same way that when a newscast runs a commercial for a politician, the effort to dissect it, what we've often found is the images have been more powerful. So while the news commentator is in effect saying, we found falsehood to be here, these are not true statements, the creator of that ad is sitting back and saying, hallelujah, I'm getting my image on there and it's legitimated, and it's the image that's going to carry, not the statement that this is a false claim. And the research demonstrates that happens.
I think you're giving too much credit to the power of advertising. I don't think that advertising has nearly that much power. What matters is it a persuasive reason to buy a product? And that's, in the last analysis, what counts. Whether the emotion is true or not, I don't think really matters.
If advertising doesn't affect people, then why are we spending all this money on it? Obviously, advertising is trying to persuade us, and not always in intellectual, rational ways, often in very much in emotional ways. You mentioned the story about political images. There's a story from the '84 campaign. I think it was Leslie Stahl on CBS, did a devastating story about how Reagan was running an empty campaign. It was just a lot of flag waving. It showed clip after clip of Reagan saying nothing with cheering crowds and waving flags. And she got a call from Reagan's campaign. Thanks a lot for the story. We couldn't buy images like that. That was wonderful. They felt that basically she was doing the job, and she thought she was doing a story that was devastating to the campaign. Obviously, there's a strong emotional appeal in these kinds of images.
Well, obviously there's a strong emotional appeal. There's a strong emotional appeal in all forms of drama. There's a strong emotional appeal when a lawyer defends his or her client. That's just part of life. But to think that people are so naive that they don't know that a commercial is out to sell product, I think is missing the point. Commercials are out to sell products, and they do a good job of it, and that's why so much money is spent on it. But I don't believe that it's working under false pretenses in any way.
I teach a couple of classes here. One of the classes I teach is writing for the media, where it's basically a survey course for all the different types of writing in radio and TV, and we do a unit on advertising. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll ask the class if they're affected by advertising, because after all, Emerson students are very savvy about the media and shouldn't be sucked into these sorts of things. And I'll stand there asking this question, holding a can of Diet Coke. And then after everybody agrees that, of course, here at Emerson we're not fooled by advertising, I'll say, is there anybody here who finds it odd that I'm standing here with a can of Diet Coke? And nobody does. And then I ask, would you think it's odd if I was standing here with a can of Tab? They're both Diet Colas put out by the same company. Why do you have the reaction to one and not to the other? And then I remind them that the initial advertising campaign for Diet Coke had the tagline, "Have you noticed how many men are drinking Diet Coke?" The thing was marketed as a diet soda that was safe for men to drink. That's a purely emotional appeal. That has nothing to do with logic. It's the same soft drink. Different sweetener, perhaps.
That's life. That's life.
Well,
I mean, to say that advertisers can't use emotional appeals is ridiculous, because emotional appeals are used in every form of our existence, and that's a normal, legitimate form of persuasion. You know, and to make one other point, a lot of people say that they're fed up with this OJ stuff. They can't take any more of this stuff. You ask them about it, and they'll start telling you every detail there is about the case.
Well, could I just raise this point, though? Yes, we're not saying you can't use emotions and stimulated emotions. On the other hand, are there no limits to the use to which that can be put, and under what circumstances? Tell me about why it is that teenagers and preteens are picking up smoking faster than those adults who are sensible with all the logic and emotional appeal about smoking are dropping it. Tell me about what really justifies Joe Camel ultimately.
I'd like to address that, if I may. As well as some other issues that are being raised about advertising. It's interesting, I mentioned to you earlier, it's the most disciplined, it's the most restricted and regulated industry out there. It's very obvious when you see it. You can almost read through what's occurring. It's probably, by the way, it's extremely effective. And it doesn't just relate to emotions. The best advertising, first and foremost, number one, it finds out from that audience, what's the makeup of the audience? Is the audience influenced more by logic or by emotion? We have two sides to our brain. And if it's a group of engineers or lawyers or physicians or people who are logically driven, the advertising is going to be logically driven as well. If it's people who are driven more by emotion than logic, it will probably have a heavier influence of emotion in the message that goes out. But the best advertising includes both an argument, a logical argument, an emotional argument as to why you should have that product. I'd like to see us get off of advertising for a moment, because it really is not the issue. The issue is the quality of information. As an educator, which I was before I started this business, and I continue to be to some degree at different universities around the area, as an educator, I'm highly concerned about the quality of information you are getting day in and day out from a variety of media, and I don't mean by that just the news media. I'm also, in my business in the public relations field, very concerned about the number of attorneys who are now practicing bad, unethical, by my standards, public relations. I teach a course, an introductory course at a nearby school that has a public relations sequence, and 45% of my students last year are going on to law school. That's frightening. That's really frightening. And I was being when I picked on the Boston Globe, it wasn't fair. But it was, again, for good debate's sake. But indeed, the people in the news media today probably have the toughest job of all, to try to sort through what they have to do and put information out. For my interest, by the way, I think there's no better, more enlightening news medium in this area than National Public Radio's WBUR, which gives me a little island of solace and information in the morning of great quality as I drive to work. Only occasionally when I flip back and forth to Don Imus to laugh, and I'll go back to WBUR.
Boy, did they push some of my hot buttons, let me tell you. I could spend a couple of hours on each of these people and enjoy it, because they all make very valid points. But there's some lines of demarcation that I'd kind of like to put a spin on here. Most of you, I think, know that I have kind of straddled both of these worlds, the practical and the academic. And since coming onto the academic side, amazingly, I found out that my field was considered unethical by many. Not just by many, by most of the students that enter my advertising classes truly believe that advertisers seek to deceive or are somewhat unethical, and indeed, yes, we're supposed to manipulate. Sean?
Yes, sir.
Can we do a little terminology check here? I want to ask you which version of manipulate you agree with. To move objects in a predetermined form, or to make people do something they don't want to do. Which one do you do?
The second.
You make people do things they don't want to do. You do.
Well, possibly. I think that it's very possible that you can actually.
What people are you talking about? You talking about your audience, or are you talking about the people who are working for you in the commercial?
Oh no, that's a given. The people who work for me in the commercial, it's a given.
That you're of course, you're moving them. They're the objects moving into your predetermined form.
Right.
All right. So how are you manipulating
the viewer?
The viewer.
I honestly believe that there's moments, and I could go through a story, but I do a lot of lottery commercials. I've done over 100, maybe more than 150. And I know that I have met people who have commented on commercials that I've done and said that they have actually moved them to go out and buy lottery tickets when they didn't think that they ought to.
Okay. Interesting. That's a very interesting value. There's so much to study from all of these points of view. And I have so many arguments for his point of view, an opposite point of view, and somewhere in the gray area in between. But we don't have time for that. But we're in the same field. I still practice advertising and PR and such, and we disagree. When you have journalists and academics and advertisers who all ourselves disagree about what our intent is, no wonder there's a problem of perception out in the real world among the audiences. It's no wonder that they're not sure. Are they or aren't they doing this on purpose? Are they trying to deceive me? I know that I spend a lot of time deprogramming. Perhaps, like Phil Amato, I'm, a little naive. I never, ever believed that what I was doing in the advertising business had any concept of being unethical. In fact, the goal was always to stay on the course. Certainly it might have something to do with the moral and, ethical upbringing that I had, but it was never mentioned, let's go out and manipulate someone today. Let's make people do what they don't want to do. We spend, as Terry says, most of our time figuring out, well, why do people do things, and why would they want my product? And if so, gee, if they would really benefit by my product, let's talk to them about it. And it's no different from as a person going door to door selling, having a conversation with the person who answers the door. Every single message from a mass media standpoint is supposed to appeal to us as individuals. And one-to-one, it's about trust. There is no point in we as advertisers to cause distrust because then you don't buy our products. Right? It's not our intent. It's not the intent to mislead in journalism when you're the Boston Globe. When you're dealing with tabloids, they have a different intent than that. My perception is. And I'm going to pick on the favorite one that I seem to be in defense of. I've spent 5 years in defense of a business that I think is absolutely marvelous and does a marvelous service to informing and problem solving for people who have too many choices. And I believe that we try hard, to be fair and equitable and ethical here. But that Joe Camel, poor old Joe, I want to talk about the first thing that Rand said. Full and complete stories, telling the whole truth. Many of you have read articles on Joe Camel, I'm sure. And one of the most often quoted research points is that Joe Camel is in the top 5 of most known characters by children. Oh my God, say audiences. No wonder children are smoking. Because they're immediately making that jump to, well, that immediately equates to running down to the store quickly and getting a pack of Camels so we can be cool too. In articles that I've read, and in Advertising Age, the full story is there, but in many it is not. Joe Camel was also on the top 5 of most disliked characters by children. Well, how different the story becomes when you have the full story. All right, and we spend a lot of time with media that don't give us the whole truth. And we who are academics and or practitioners have the responsibility of defining that difference. And we as consumers, perhaps it's my fault that I come into an academic arena defending myself when I never did anything to change that perception when I was in the business. I was too busy doing ads and PR and satisfying clients. I wasn't thinking, you know, I really have to go out and make sure the image of advertising is okay. I thought it was. I thought it was fine. And I thought all these people who had these little research projects that were so narrow and so silly that everybody thought that they were silly. But I wasn't looking at the whole world understanding what I do. I was looking at what I understand. And I think it's the same for many different communication fields. We're so focused on what we do. And the burden is to us to follow that taste and decency concept, you know, that is inherent to the advertising principles that I follow, and not maybe watch those tabloid shows. If they have no audience, maybe they won't be there. But we, each individually, have to follow through on that. Thank you all.
Going last, it either gives you a lot to say or nothing to say. I'm not quite sure. I think one of the things that was brought up this morning, which is really important, is the quality of the information we're getting. When Brian talked about quoting hard copy and quoting Inside Edition, those are questions that really bother me. I know those people are paid. And once the Tonya Harding story came out, we found out who was being paid how much. And for me, that is very important for the audience to know. When a news station who's running hard copy, or any station that's running hard copy, quotes that in their news program, that changes the public's perception of hard copy. Even though people at home are perhaps saying, that's a tabloid show, once your local news person, or Dan Rather, or Connie Chung, or Tom Brokaw, all get out there and say, this was on hard copy today, or this was on another tabloid show, or this was on a talk show today, that changes the audience's perception of how valuable that information is. And what that does is that also clouds the line. It clouds the line between what we find as journalists who will go out and say, will you talk to me? To that whole idea of saying, I will pay you X thousands of dollars if you talk to me. So I think that's a point that was brought up this morning that really troubles me as a journalist. I know that as an educator, that's something that we really have to bring to the surface, that we're looking for quality of information. We have become an infotainment society. We want MTV. We want fast stories. One of the panelists brought up this morning the idea of, is there enough time? Are there enough pages? Well, there will never be enough pages. There will never be enough column inches. There will never be enough television time. It is, as a journalist, as working in the field, everybody is always saying, I need more, I need more. Just like your professor at the end of the class period says, I just have one more thing to tell you as you're running out the door. I mean, we always need that extra time, and that, to me, that's very interesting. In terms of advertising, I think what we tend to lose in advertising is audience responsibility as well, and the same thing in news. That how do we perceive our audience, and then how does the audience perceive us? How many people do you know that actually say, I watch X channel because it gives me the best information? No, I like the fuzzy weatherman. You know, I really like the anchor. You know, I really like the co-anchor situation. The man and the woman work really well together. I mean, nobody sits there and says, well, I read in the Globe this morning, it said this. I read in the Herald, it said this. I watched this channel, it said that. I watched that channel. I watched 4, 5, and 7, and 56, and 38, and Fox, and Neckin, and, everybody, and now I know exactly what's going on. And I watch this channel more often because it gives me the best information. So I think audience participation is extremely important. Too many people, as an audience, are more willing to just sit back and say, well, okay, yeah, go ahead. Come on, I'm ready. You know, it's the couch potato syndrome of news. You know, if you want bubble gum, there's MTV, there are the comedy shows, whatever. And I think that the lines are being are getting fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier. I mean, the whole Jenny Jones sequence today. We told them we didn't tell them. This one says, yes, I saw them, they said everything was fine. This one says, no, they weren't. Whatever, I mean, who's telling the truth here? Ethically, is skirting an issue okay? I mean, maybe the perception of the person who did the alleged murderer, maybe his perception was that he wasn't told. Whereas the producer, maybe the information was manipulated so it was there, but it wasn't there. In advertising, that's sort of it. I mean, you kind of say, well, you know, what's there? You look at it and say, what's really there? When they're selling you jeans and you only see people with these great bodies, are they selling you these jeans? What are they selling you? Again, the malign Joe Camel, I don't know what to say about Joe Camel. He's like, I don't know what the big flap is personally. But I think when you talk about ethics, you need to talk about both sides. That audience does have some responsibility as well. And as journalists, I think journalists has the responsibility to always bring up ethical questions. That you have